Welcome back to the Transform Talent podcast, brought to you by the Talent Solutions. I'm your host, Georgina Huntley. Now, I'm sure you'll all have heard the words diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging many times over the last few years. We all know these values and processes are fundamental to building a successful business and, more importantly, encouraging the well-being and success of everyone in our workplace. But what is often missing in this messaging is the practical steps on how to build this workplace culture. How do we create space for people to feel safe, feel like they belong and thrive in our workplaces? What's the key ingredient and what role do managers critically play? To discuss this important subject, I'm delighted to be joined by Trishna Naik, Global DE&I Manager at Jaguar Land Rover. Trishna is a multi-award finalist and describes herself as a role model for those who do not see themselves represented in business. She's over 2.5 years' experience leading teams that create and implement the DEI strategy across Jaguar Land Rover. And we're going to dive into the lessons she's learned in this role and her career as a whole. Okay, so Trishna, we've talked about your experience slightly at Jaguar Land Rover, but can you give us a little bit more of an insight into your career and your journey into the role that you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so I think actually it probably would take me all the way back to university, to be honest. I never thought I was someone who could work in a corporate world, not because of the environment. I just wasn't convinced that opportunity was there for me. So it was something that I never really saw in my future until, I had a great placement tutor at university who encouraged me to go for an internship at a kind of big corporate company. And since I got the taste for it then, I built more of my confidence to say, you know what, I can, that world is made for me.
Excellent. And did you intentionally go into the role of, or look to go into the role of DE&I, or is that something that's come through your journey in your career?
No, definitely not intentional at all. Like most career decisions I make at the minute, to be honest, I kind of see where they take me. My background is all in procurement and purchasing. So that's kind of what I've done prior to DE&I.
Wow.
And moving.
You're right, because you do, as you go through career, you kind of, and more so I think nowadays, you don't have that sort of like, that's the job I want to do in the future. It's how you find what your skills connect to and what you get passionate about as you go along on that journey.
Yeah, and I think what I used to find is that I used to do, whilst purchasing was the day job, I used to do things along the side of it, right? Things that I'd volunteer for in whichever company I was in, whether that was employee engagement, delivering dementia awareness sessions, joining networks or ERGs within businesses, and then kind of started to realise that actually that was my prime purpose for coming to work, and started to really think about, why do I get up in the morning? What is it that I'm actually enjoying? And it was all the stuff that I was doing on the side, which was all people-related things. So that's what made me kind of want to think about taking the jump.
It's a really powerful piece when you actually connect to that purpose, and then it sort of changes your perspective on the work that you're doing, and you sort of start recognising the impact that you're having on the people around you. It's quite a special opportunity. So you talked about your journey into the role that you're doing now, but along that route, because you've obviously made some changes on the way, different pathways, but along that route, did you ever come up against any adversity or struggle in any moves that you were making? And as we mentioned, you're in Jaguar Land Rover. It's quite a male-dominated environment, so there must be some barriers along the way that you faced.
I think there's probably barriers, not just at Jaguar Land Rover, in most companies, and I think I've probably experienced a mix of them. I think a lot of my experience is around age, being young. I experienced that quite a lot, and then probably around being female, and not all the time as well. I'll add, it's every so often, and I think in changing roles, I think some of it, especially age-related, and when I'm making jumps between functions, has the potential to look naive from a young person. So I understand, the perception that it could maybe give off, that maybe could create some of those barriers. But I think JLR's been really supportive of me actually moving from one to a completely different function that I'd never worked in before. So
great opportunity, and great that you're with an employer that supports that environment for you to make those moves once you identify what your key skill sets are. We're talking about, and we're here today to talk about DE&I. Where do you think in your experiences, both with Jaguar Land Rover and other organisations, because I know you interact with many other organisations as well, what do you think we get wrong as organisations when we talk about DE&I and how we want to address it? We obviously recognise the importance, but what do you think organisations are getting wrong?
I think the first thing we're getting wrong is that DE&I is seen as a extra thing to do, something to do on top of the day job, as opposed to just a way of being. So I think that's kind of the first mistake that falls down, is that it makes people think that they're going to have to do more than they already give to their businesses, which I think is the first mistake. I think the other bit is then getting people to understand why it isn't something on top of that, which is around, actually, it's all around your behaviours and how you interact with people. And something I've definitely personally learned is more around that vulnerability piece and building connections with people. So just focusing on inclusion first and letting diversity come as a result of being inclusive.
Yeah. And you mentioned there a key point about vulnerability, and the idea of being vulnerable in the workplace to some can be really daunting. But from your experience, what do you think are some practical examples of how vulnerability can really be encouraged in a workplace?
I think the first thing to say is it definitely isn't easy in the workplace. It's something I've probably only done, I would say, for 6 months now, in all honesty, in all the time that I've worked. So it's no mean feat to say that being vulnerable at work is easy. And I think, when I started the role behaving in a way that I thought a manager should behave, as opposed to just how I would behave. So I think that's one thing to get, to be really clear about, is you actually can there is no scripted way of like how someone is meant to behave, in corporate or non-corporate worlds. And I think the more that I've tried to, when I say be vulnerable, it comes at all different levels. So it's like sharing bits of information about myself, just generally. So whilst we might talk about home life in a very general surface level sense, and you might say refer to like your partner at home or something like that, it's more talking about when other things are happening. So I'm British born, but I'm Indian. So if, for example, I'm doing something for Diwali, I'm just talking a bit more about the things that I've got coming up, what I'm looking forward to, but then also sharing the weeks where, for example, I don't know, I might be feeling down, or I'm having a rough week, or I just didn't sleep well last night and therefore I've woke up in some sort of a foul mood. It's just kind of saying to the team, do you know what, I'm not feeling great today, so if something doesn't make sense, or if I completely forget something, like just do this and this, but I just wanted to let you know. And it's not that it has to be a deep discussion about why, it's just letting them know so that they can support me as much as I can try and support them.
And this is really a key thing about the manager's role in creating an environment of inclusivity and belonging, and kind of having to intentionally set the example. Because, as you say, as you grow up through your career, it does take a while to get to the point where you can be your true authentic self, or you feel you are, and it happens because you're in an environment where you feel comfortable and confident to do it. So as managers, we have to create that environment intentionally. And do you find from you sharing more the inner you to your teams that they react in a good way? Do they then do that themselves? What's your experience with that?
I think the more that I give, then the more I receive, ultimately. So the more open I am gives a kind of open forum for the team to tell me the same things, when they're having a rough week or when they need extra support. And for me specifically, in my team, I think it's strengthened the relationships in terms of knowing more about each other, knowing how to support each other. And it's also helped me develop skills that for me aren't necessarily always on surface accessible. People have, different personality types. I'm, if anyone reads anything about the DESA model, I'm firmly between red and yellow, which is really like action orientated and the idea space, and is firmly away from the kind of process and people space. So having those kind of, whilst I'm not saying that I'm unfriendly, having those kind of general chit chats.
I'm not a people person.
Yeah, exactly. Isn't something that comes natural to me because I'm very like action and task focused.
Yeah.
I'm at work, so I need to get things done. So it never occurs to me to have that first. But I think having a little bit of that vulnerability and starting some of those conversations has helped me either support people who are people focused first, but also just open that dialogue a bit more and build a stronger relationship.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you mentioned about the different sorts of people and how important it is to have that in your team, because you get the diversity of thought, which is critical in the world of innovation, and especially in the environment you work in. Innovation is really key for the organisation you work for. But when we talk about creating that environment of safety, psychological safety, or sort of diversity, we're in a position now where we've got sort of 4 to potentially 5 generations in the workplace. And how do you think for managers, what do we need to do to help bridge those generations and make sure that we're creating the right environment and getting the most out of the individuals at work?
Yeah. I think ultimately the generational difference all through the kind of generations you have in work, it of course is harder the older the generation, because that isn't something that was encouraged, and it certainly wasn't something that was, the way you behaved or did in a workplace. So I think it's worth acknowledging that it's definitely harder for those who have been in businesses longer where that's never been a thing. So I actually think the newer generations are probably ready for those kind of conversations. And, someone like myself, I'm an open book. Like, I don't mind sharing things, and I'm trusting until someone gives me a reason not to, but I still think it's worth thinking about. It feels like a risk when you take that first step, but if the senior managers don't take that first step, then the younger generations who are joining don't know that it's safe to return the favour. So it's all about, with managers, it's having to take that risk and having to take the first step, whilst it is slightly terrifying the first time you do so.
Yeah, and as you say, actually, leaders need to be showing that vulnerability, and it's almost a harder journey for leaders to be going on to create the right environment of belonging, because it's something that's new to them, or something that is not how they've been brought up in the world of work. So it's a tough one, but we need to be deliberate about it in the way that we're trying to create the right environment. Let's talk about an example of someone interviewing from a job. So from interview through to success and promotions, how can companies really consider, so slightly aside to the manager, but how can companies more broadly really consider all of those stages, I suppose, of an employee life cycle, from interview all the way through, to make sure that they're cultivating the right culture of diversity, equity and inclusion? Yeah,
I think that comfort level still resonates through the entire employee life cycle. So if, for example, someone comes in for an interview, it doesn't have to feel so, we're going to ask you 10 questions. These are the questions. Thanks. We will let you know next week. Yeah. There still needs to be that injection of personality, of who you are. You want to know who the person is. You want to know if they're going to be a good fit for the behaviours of the business. You're only going to know that if they're relaxed. So you still have to hold those, whilst at a different level of vulnerability, it still needs to hold those comfort levels of conversations. And I think when you onboard someone into the business, it's that comfort level of them, for example, potentially asking for any reasonable adjustments they might need. And the same as the interview process. And then throughout, it's all about kind of retention and how you support your talent. So actually, the more they feel comfortable, the more they feel supported, the more they're going to come to you with questions about development, with the want to stay. So I actually think that building that comfortability through the employee life cycle is probably the key. Yeah,
absolutely. And you mentioned when we were speaking earlier about your career and the involvement you had outside of the jobs you were doing, that is how you sort out your passion. You mentioned BRGs or affinity networks or groups like that within the workplace. How important do you think that is for organisations to be sort of focusing and allowing people to create those environments?
I think it's really important. I think they start as what I would call community safe spaces. Yeah. They are built by the groups who are underrepresented as a safe space for them to share with each other any issues they're coming up against, or even just to have someone to talk to who may have experienced the same thing. And I think that's how a lot of them start. But then what they build into is almost like influencers across the business, and that's how we should see them. They're ultimately develop a platform that enables them to educate, enables them to talk about, and enables them to share and be vulnerable about things that affect them that maybe other people wouldn't have considered. So I think they're super important. They're probably the key to reaching further across the business, because there's only so much that a central team will be able to do in terms of reaching everyone. So I think they're vital. I don't think DE&I could actually expand across an entire company without them.
No, I absolutely agree. And from my experiences within ManpowerGroup and across our different brands, we sort of started on this journey a few years ago. And in the first instance, when we started setting up what we call our affinity networks, it was very much more an educational piece, and sort of what people would see as allies would come together. Yeah. What we've seen as they've grown and they've matured is it's more about communities of interest, and actually all the affinity networks tend to work together now and and share their experiences more broadly across the organisation. And the impact has been phenomenal. So I agree. I think it's a key foundation to help support and drive that culture of inclusivity.
Yeah.
So what I want to ask you some sort of top tips. So for those listeners that we've got that maybe on the diversity sort of maturity journey and they want to get some top tips, what are 3 real top tips that a leader in role now can do today to improve the inclusion in their team and therefore the broader diversity in their workplace?
So first top tip is you have to take the risk. It's time to share a bit more about yourself. There's a reason that we come to work, to make money, but there is more to everyone than just the place that they work at. So my first thing would be take the jump, whether it's a small one, whether it's a big one, whether it's something like saying the week you're having, that's got to be the first move. I think the second thing to know that might be comforting to some people who kind of want to know, I don't want to take the jump without knowing it's definitely worked. The reason you'll know it's worked is you'll know if your team says something similar back. Whether it's when they're having a bad week or whether it's they say, how can I support you? Those little kind of sentences will tell you that what you've done has worked.
So that key about listening as well, isn't it? Listening to what's happening around you and how people are changing their responses.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's kind of the first bit, because that breaks down the first wall where someone goes, I wasn't really sure if we could talk about this stuff. And I think the second tip is probably, I would say, I normally don't use this phrase, but it is being comfortable with the uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So knowing that actually it is going to feel extremely odd to someone who isn't normally, kind of that way with their colleagues at work. And it's probably going to continue to, but also you have to be really open to feedback. So, personally, I had to sit, with different parts of the team and actually hear some of the things that they had maybe felt, whether I intended it or not, in the ways that I had behaved previously when I wasn't really sharing any of myself. And that is hard stuff to hear. But I think the second tip would be open to feedback, because the more that you show them that the door is open to hearing that, yes, the more you'll receive, but the more it gives you the chance to actually change and think about the type of leader that you actually want to become.
I think that's a really great point, and having to be really deliberate in about that approach. But also, as you mentioned, it takes time. So it's not just doing it once and then thinking, okay, I've done that. It's about continuing to do it and build the habit, isn't it?
Yeah. So like, for example, in one-to-ones or development conversations, they shouldn't just be about the manager talking about the person in their team. They should be two-way conversations. They should be, this is how I think we're getting on. And then someone will say, this is what I think. Okay, great. Have you got any feedback for me as a manager? Is there something I should be doing better or more differently to support you? Because ultimately, I think where DE&I moves us to is switching the model from, managers who manage teams to leaders who serve their teams. And absolutely. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, absolutely agree. The benefit of that sort of servant leadership approach is and it's been talked about for years, but it's becoming more and more profound now in the impact it has on both individual and organisational success. Yeah. And any final top tip? Your number 3.
Let's see. I would say be curious would be my last tip. If there's anything you aren't sure of, that you don't know about, just go and learn it. I think people from any underrepresented groups will always know if there's positive intent behind a question or curiosity, and they're always more than willing to help and sit down with you. So, if you have a question, be curious, ask with positive intent. It's the only way you're going to learn. So staying quiet is not going to work. So when I say be curious, I mean be vocally curious.
I love that. So it's because it's very easy to be unsure how to approach something.
Yeah.
So that key of just, as you said, people will be cool to help you through it, and they will, recognise that there's positive intent. So rather than shy away from it, just lean in and ask the questions. I love that.
And the thing is, if you say something wrong, we're all humans, we're fallible, we're going to make mistakes. It's actually also about how you deal with it afterwards. It's, talking to them about that, what you didn't mean. It's apologising. It's making sure that you learn from it the next time. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I love that. It's decent and right human behaviour. So a really good example to bring that proper authenticity into the workplace.
Yeah.
So one final question for you, Trishna, if I may. On our last podcast, we were speaking with Becky Frankovich, who's the ManpowerGroup COO, and I asked her for her sort of future predictions. And one of the key areas that she focuses on is what she calls females fueling the future of work. Yeah. And if I was to ask you, in the world of DE&I, what you could see as your sort of real big goal for the future and how you see the world of DE&I, what would it be?
I think ultimately that DE&I roles don't exist. A world where they wouldn't need to. We've moved to a place where actually people are comfortable to be themselves. They're having the right conversations. And because they're more comfortable at work, those Sunday scaries don't come in. People aren't dreading work on Monday. They're enjoying where they spend most of their time.
I love that. What a brilliant goal to be aiming for, that it's not something that has to be a role that is enforced, but it's something that is just natural, and we've built cultures of complete inclusivity.
Yeah.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Transform Talent podcast. Thank you to Trishna for your time and perspective on embracing vulnerability in building a culture of DEIB in the workplace. If you want to know more about our perspective on these topics, take a look at our 2024 Workforce Trends Report, The Age of Adaptability. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in once again, and please make sure you'll subscribe to our podcast on your preferred platform so you don't miss an episode. See you next time.